Let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Suozzi, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here today. I have some very straightforward questions for you. Mr. Secretary, are you aware that New York State is a net donor to the federal government? They send a lot more to the federal government than they get back?
I am, and that's because there's a lot of wealthy people in New York.
Are you aware that New York is, in fact, the largest net donor in the United States of America of any state?
I knew it was close between that and California, but thank you for clarifying that.
Are you aware, Mr. Secretary, that most blue states, most Democratic states in America, are net donors to the federal government?
I've never looked at it in that comparison. Again, we have a progressive tax system.
So most, I understand,
wealthy
I understand
people
the tax
pay more
system.
money.
So most blue states, I want to assure you, are net donors to the federal government. In fact, most red states are net takers from the federal government, with the exception of Texas. Were you aware of that?
Again, I don't look at these numbers that way.
Mr. Secretary, do you think that the cap on state and local taxes at $10,000 is fair?
I do.
Do you think that it's fair that taxpayers pay taxes on taxes they've already paid to state and local governments?
I do.
Mr. Secretary, are you aware that there was a passionate debate in the United States of America when the progressive federal income tax was created that said this may not be fair to state and local governments, and we want to make sure that state and local governments are protected? That's why we created a SALT deduction. Do you aware that there was a big debate in this country when we first created the federal tax code?
Yes, and I know there's been many debates over this issue since then.
Mr. Secretary, are you aware that many people are leaving New York State and other states because of the high taxes that they pay in those states that are no longer deductible at the federal level?
I am, and I think that's quite unfortunate. I think that some of those high-tax states, including New York and California, should think about lowering their taxes.
Mr. Secretary, are you aware that many wealthy people from New York State, probably people that you may know well, are leaving New York State and going to other states to change their residency to avoid state and local taxes because they can no longer deduct them?
I am.
Mr. Secretary, when those people leave places like New York State and New York City, who pays the remaining taxes that they're no longer paying?
Well, again, I think these states, including California, should.
Well, I know that you want to take the long arm of the federal government and reach into the state and local governments and tell them what to do. But assuming that taxes are still the same, if wealthy people leave New York State and other people leave New York State to move to other low-tax states, who picks up the burden of that tax burden?
Again, I don't want to take the long arm of government.
Well, you're saying that they should change their policies, so that's up to the state and local governments to do that. But I'm just asking you, if wealthy people and other people leave these states to go to places like Florida and South Carolina, North Carolina, and Arizona, and other places, who picks up the burden for those taxes?
Obviously, the rest of the people who are there.
Right. So a lot of lower income, middle income people have to pay that burden. Or, as you suggest, they can cut the services for the local and state governments. They can cut fire, they can cut police, they can cut teachers, they can cut other costs, thereby decreasing the quality of life in those states. So, Mr. Secretary, I want you to know that the House of Representatives has passed a SALT reform bill to reinstate the SALT deduction. It's been supported by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National Association of Counties, the National League of Cities, and on with others, the teachers, police, and others. And the President said recently that he's open to the idea of talking about reinstating the SALT deduction. Have you discussed that with the President?
I haven't discussed it recently, but I'm happy to bring it up with him.
I would appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize